Alaska is a land where natural beauty coexists with the abyss, and beyond every horizon lies something that humans cannot explain. Here, among mountain ranges, permafrost, and icy rivers, people disappear as if they had never been there. No signs of a struggle, no bodies, no answers to the main question: what happened to them? Official reports dryly attribute these disappearances to accidents, storms, or wild animals, but locals whisper otherwise. They say that something lives in these lands that does not obey the laws we know. Today, we will tell you about 3 disappearances, each of which defies logic and common sense. These stories have it all: unexplained findings, a complete lack of traces, and details that will send shivers down your spine. We begin in January 1992, when experienced trapper Leslie Jonathan set out on his usual 3-day route along the frozen Delta Creek and was never seen again. January 28, 1992. Alaska Range, Hayes Pass area. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. The temperature hovers around minus 14.8 degrees Fahrenheit. For Leslie Jonathan, this wasn't a job, it was a way of life. At 45, he was a trapper through and through, one of the few who still lived by the old ways of Alaska. He wasn't a tourist or a government employee in uniform. He was a trapper whose family had been doing this for generations. These mountains and rivers were his home. He could read tracks like others read books, predict the weather by the color of the sky, and knew the habits of every animal in the area. That morning, he set out on his usual 3-day route along the trails to check his traps for marten and beaver along the frozen Delta Creek. He had done this hundreds of times. He had a team of 6 strong, proven Malamutes, a sled loaded with everything he needed, and his old Marlin .336 caliber rifle. Not for protection, but as a working tool. He had an agreement with the Park Service station to check in on the radio every few days just to let them know he was okay. It wasn't a requirement, but a precaution taken by all the local winterers. He was supposed to check in on the evening of January 30th, but the radio was silent. He was silent on the 31st, and on February 1st. At first, there was no panic. These things happen in Alaska. Blizzards, radio malfunctions. But Jonathan was known for his incredible sense of responsibility. If he could get in touch, he would. By February 3rd, his closest neighbor, who lived 50 miles away, and the Park Service coordinator realized that something was wrong. On February 4th, after 2 days of no response on the radio, a National Guard helicopter was sent to fly his presumed route. Searching from the air in such conditions is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Endless white plains, cliffs, dense fir forests. The pilot and observer scanned the area for hours. Then, closer to noon, they spotted it. A dark spot on the dazzling white blanket of the frozen valley through which Delta Creek meandered. As the helicopter descended, the scene that met their eyes defied logical explanation. It was Jonathan's sled. It stood right in the middle of a vast, open, icy space. 6 dogs, still harnessed, lay huddled together in the snow. They were alive but looked exhausted and frightened. The helicopter landed at a distance, and 2 rescuers made their way to the sled. There was not a single human footprint within dozens of feet of the sled and dogs. Not one. The snow was pristine, except for the dogs' paw prints and the sled runners, which led here and then broke off. It looked as if Leslie Jonathan had vanished from the sled. A closer look raised more questions than it answered. The sled was fully equipped. Food supplies, fuel for the burner, a sleeping bag, a tent. Everything was in place, neatly tied down. His rifle was in a case strapped to the sled. Later, an examination would confirm that the magazine was full and there was no bullet in the chamber. The weapon had not been used. His thermos with cold tea was lying on the sled. There were no signs of a struggle, no disorder. The dogs, although frightened, had no injuries. They were hungry and thirsty, but unharmed. It seemed as if their owner had gotten up and vanished into thin air. A ground search operation began. A team of trappers like Jonathan and several rangers combed the area square by square. The first 2 days yielded absolutely nothing. The leading theory was that he had fallen through the ice. But engineers who arrived at the scene drilled through the ice for several miles, It was more than 3 feet thick, with no cracks or holes. That theory was ruled out. Then they suggested a sudden heart attack or other medical problem. But even in that case, the man would have fallen off the sled, leaving a trail. He couldn't have just disappeared. The strangest detail was the dogs. The lead dog, named Kai, was known for his calm and confident temperament. Rescuers found him cowering under the sled, whimpering and growling at anyone who tried to approach him. All the dogs showed signs of extreme stress. Something had frightened them very severely. On the 3rd day of the search, one of the trackers, an Athabascan Indian named Joe Whitehorse, strayed almost a mile west of the group's main route toward a wooded slope. What he found there changed the course of the entire investigation and turned it from a rescue operation into something completely different. These were not tracks. Instead, there were deep furrows in the snow. They were spaced unevenly and unlike anything they had seen before. They were not bear tracks. Grizzlies hibernate at this time of year. They weren't wolf or wolverine tracks either. The grooves were long, narrow, and dug up to 12 inches deep into the snow. It was as if someone had pierced the snow with something long and hard, like crutches. But these crutches left too narrow an imprint. And there weren't just 2, but sometimes 3 or 4 in a group, as if the creature was leaning on several limbs at once. Joe followed this strange chain of dents. It led up the slope into a thick spruce forest. After a few hundred feet, he found Jonathan's first item, his heavy parka. It hadn't been taken off neatly. It had been torn at the seams on the back and shoulders, as if it had been pulled off with incredible force without being unbuttoned. There wasn't a drop of blood on the fabric, just roughly torn clothing thrown onto the snow. It was becoming evident that Leslie hadn't left of his own accord. The group moved on along the trail. The atmosphere was tense. People walked in silence, gripping their weapons tightly. Strange tracks led them deeper into the forest, and here they began to find other things. A snowshoe broken in half, which had been attached to Jonathan's backpack. A lighter had fallen out of a pocket. And then they saw blood, a few drops on the snow, and next to them was something that made even the most experienced hunters fall silent. It was a fang, huge, yellowish, about 4 inches long, curved like a dagger. It did not belong to any known predator in North America. It was too thin for a bear and utterly different in shape from a wolf or cougar. It just lay there in the snow, next to the drops of blood that analysis later confirmed belonged to Leslie Jonathan. The search was called off at dusk that day. The next day, the operation headquarters received orders from Anchorage. All volunteers and local hunters were ordered to leave the area. A special team arrived, not from the Park Service. These people were dressed in military gear, kept to themselves, and did not talk to anyone. The official reason was increased avalanche danger and difficult weather conditions. Although the weather was clear, the search was called off after 2 days. Leslie Jonathan was never found. The official conclusion was missing, presumed dead, as a result of an accident in the wild. There was no mention of strange tracks, torn parkas, or a fang found in the final report. The case was closed. We will probably never know what happened to Leslie Jonathan. His name joined the long list of those who disappeared without a trace in the wilds of Alaska. But the story of his disappearance is not just a tragedy. It is a chilling reminder that in the wildest and most untouched corners of our planet, there may be life forms that do not fit into our understanding of biology. Predators that have evolved in complete isolation and for whom humans are nothing more than prey. And sometimes when humans venture too far, they risk encountering what lies waiting in the permafrost. September 8, 1987, Olympic National Park, Washington State. A vast, wild area where temperate rainforest meets rocky peaks. The day was clear and warm for early fall, perfect conditions for working outdoors. Martin Krause, a 31-year-old assistant ranger, was precisely the kind of person you'd want to see on a job like this. He was in great shape, meticulous, methodical, and knew these trails like the back of his hand. He wasn't a novice or an adventurer. This was his profession, and he took it very seriously. His task for the day was completely routine, even dull. Check a few abandoned huts and old miners' shacks in the Snowhook Trail area. It was standard procedure before the rainy season began. Make sure the buildings weren't occupied by squatters, damaged by vandals, or dangerous to hikers who might stray off the trail. He took a light backpack with water, food for the day, a first aid kit, and his small transistor radio. He often listened to it during stops to break the silence of the forest. Before leaving, as always, he left a note in his journal. He indicated his exact route, listed the huts he planned to visit, and indicated his estimated time of return, around 8 p.m., that is, in 12 hours. He set off on his route, and no one saw him again. He did not return that evening. At first, no one raised the alarm. In such terrain, a delay of a couple of hours was not unusual. Perhaps he had stumbled upon a fallen tree and had to find a way around it. Or maybe he had been delayed while writing a report on one of the huts. But when he did not appear by the next morning and his radio remained silent, the senior ranger sounded the alarm. 24 hours passed. By noon, when 36 hours had elapsed, a full-scale search operation was underway. Dozens of rangers, volunteers, and several canine units participated in the search. The searchers were confident they would find him quickly. The weather was good. Kraus was an experienced professional, and if something had happened to him, an injury, a fall, he should have been somewhere near the trail. But the first day of searching yielded nothing, neither did the second. The dogs lost their trail about 2 miles from the trailhead. They just lost him. There were no diverging tracks, indicating that he had strayed from the route. His scent disappeared in one place as if he had dissolved into thin air. On the 4th day of the search, September 12th, one of the groups was combing through the thick undergrowth north of the trail. One of the volunteers happened to look up and saw something that didn't belong in the forest. About 65 feet from the trail, at a height of about 7 feet, Kraus's radio was hanging from a smooth, sturdy branch of a Douglas fir tree. The discovery immediately raised a lot of questions. The radio was hanging from its leather strap, which was neatly slung over the branch. It hadn't been thrown there. If it had, it would most likely have fallen or caught on something. It had been hung there deliberately. The branch was too high to reach while standing on the ground. You would have had to jump or climb something. But the strangest thing was what was under the tree, or rather what wasn't there. The ground under the tree, a thick layer of moss, ferns, and fallen pine needles, was untouched. Not a single footprint, not a broken twig, not a flattened patch of moss. There was no sign that anyone had stood there trying to reach the branch. No tracks were leading to the tree from the trail, or from the tree into the forest. It was physically impossible. To hang a radio, a person would have had to leave some trace. But there were none. The search immediately concentrated within a few miles of the tree. Rangers combed every ravine, every stream, every rock ledge. They found nothing. No backpack, no clothes, no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. Investigators began working through theories, each of which led to a dead end. A wild animal attack? Impossible. A bear or a cougar would have left tracks, blood, and torn clothing. And they certainly wouldn't have hung a radio on a tree branch. Robbery or murder? Kraus had no enemies, and again there were no signs of a struggle. Why would the attacker take all his belongings but leave the radio behind, and in such a conspicuous manner? An accident? If he had fallen and injured himself, he would have been found. He couldn't have gotten far from where he left the radio. Voluntary disappearance? Martin was married, had a stable life, and loved his job. He had no reason to drop everything and go. And even if we assume that this was the case, the act with the radio receiver seems like a meaningless, symbolic gesture that does not fit into the logic of an escape. Gradually, the focus shifted to Kraus's psychological state. His colleagues described him as a completely stable and well-balanced person. However, one of his close friends later mentioned that Martin had become a little more withdrawn in the weeks before his disappearance. The searchers reached the huts he was supposed to check. The first 4 were fine, empty, and untouched. But in the last, most remote hut, they discovered something strange. On the dusty wooden floor, someone had laid out several small, perfectly symmetrical spirals made of small river stones. It did not look like a child's game or a ritual. It was a methodical, precise, and utterly meaningless process. There was no evidence that Kraus had done this, but there were no other signs of human presence in the hut. This gave rise to the most disturbing theory. A sudden and acute psychotic breakdown. Could Martin Krause, for some unknown reason, have lost touch with reality in the middle of his journey? Could he have entered the hut himself, spent hours laying out these spirals, and then, upon leaving, committed one last meaningful but irrational act, hanging his radio on a branch as a farewell gesture, before disappearing into the thickest part of the forest, never to return? This version is scarier than any predator or murderer. It suggests that the greatest danger to humans in the wild is not what lurks outside, but what can suddenly break inside. The active search was called off after 2 weeks when the autumn rains began, washing away any hypothetical traces that might have remained. Martin Krause was never found. 7 years later, he was officially declared dead. The case was closed. Nothing remained of him except the silent artifact, a radio that hung in a tree for several days before being taken down and placed in a box with other evidence. Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska in July is a sight that is difficult to describe in words. Bright blue ice, emerald green grass peeking through the rocks, and deafening silence, broken only by the crackling of the glacier and the cries of birds. Exit Glacier is the most accessible part of this icy world. Several well-equipped trails lead to it, which are used by hundreds of people every day. This is not a dense taiga, but a popular tourist route. That is why what happened on July 15, 2001 seems so impossible. Andrew Kane was not a typical teenager. Quiet and thoughtful, he was obsessed with photography. While his peers were into sports or video games, Andrew was saving up for new lenses for his Canon EOS Rebel 2000 film camera. A trip to Alaska with his family was his dream. He could sit in one spot for hours, waiting for the right light to get that perfect shot. On that day, the Keene family joined a small tour group for a hike to a viewpoint near the Exit Glacier. The route was moderately difficult, about 3 miles one way. Following standard procedure, the guide split the group into pairs so that no one would get lost. Andrew's partner was another teenager, 16-year-old Kevin Richardson. At first, everything went as usual. The group slowly made its way up the trail. Andrew stopped frequently to take pictures, but quickly caught up with the others. Kevin, his partner, later told investigators that they hardly spoke. Andrew was wholly absorbed in what he was doing. About halfway to the summit, the trail curves, offering an awe-inspiring view of the ice field. The sun came out from behind the clouds, and the light reflecting off the glacier created a stunning scene. It was at that moment that Andrew stopped. According to Kevin, he raised his camera and said the last words anyone ever heard him utter. "Wow, go on, I'll catch up in a minute." Kevin nodded and continued, catching up with the group, which was only 100 feet ahead. He didn't see anything dangerous about it. They were on a wide, well-marked trail. There were other tourists around. What could happen in a minute? The minute stretched into 5. When the leading group reached a small rest area, Kevin looked back. Andrew was not on the trail. He figured he was still taking pictures, or maybe had decided to turn back. He reported this to the guide, but he didn't think much of it either, assuming the guy had just gotten carried away and would show up soon. But he didn't show up. When it became clear 20 minutes later that Andrew was missing, the guide sent one of his assistants down the trail. He reached the start of the route, but Andrew was nowhere to be found. Panic began to set in. The group descended, shouting his name. There was no response. By evening, the National Park Service launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. The first 48 hours are the most critical for finding a missing person. All available resources were deployed in the operation. Dozens of rescuers on foot, rangers, volunteers, a helicopter with a thermal imager, and several dog teams. They were sure it was a standard case. Most likely the teenager had twisted his ankle while stepping off the trail or got lost in the thick alder thickets that grew along the edges of the route. But the search yielded nothing. The dogs picked up Andrew's scent on the trail, leading them right to the spot where Kevin had last seen him, and then nothing. The trail ended. It didn't go to the right or the left, it just disappeared, as if Andrew had vanished into thin air at that point. Rescuers combed every inch of the area around that spot. No signs of a struggle, no signs of a fall from the slope, not a single item of clothing. Nothing. By the end of the second day, hopes of finding Andrew alive were beginning to fade. The weather was deteriorating, and cold rain fell during the night. Then, on the third day, the search party, checking a rocky moraine, a pile of boulders left behind by a glacier, about half a mile from the trail, made their first discovery. And this discovery did not clarify the situation, but only confused it to the utmost. It was Andrew's shirt, the bright red and blue flannel shirt he had been wearing that day. But it wasn't just lying on the ground. It had been neatly spread out and weighed down by 3 huge granite boulders. The search team leader, experienced ranger David Rask, later described this in his report as highly unusual. The stones were hefty. Each was estimated to weigh between 40 and 60 kilograms. One person, let alone a 17-year-old teenager, could not have lifted them and placed them neatly on the shirt by himself. This would have required the effort of at least 2 adult men or the use of some lever, but there were no traces of such a device nearby. The shirt itself was not torn or stained with blood. It was pressed into the ground under the enormous weight. It did not look like an accident, but rather a deliberate act. Someone wanted this shirt to be found, but went to inhuman lengths to secure it. It made no sense. It was like some ritual or message written in a language no one understood. The discovery was shocking. Now the leading theory was kidnapping and murder. The FBI joined the investigation. Agents began re-interviewing everyone who had been on the trail that day. But all the hikers in Andrew's group had alibis, and their statements matched. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had seen Andrew talking to anyone. The next day, the 4th day of the search, another group made a second, even stranger discovery. About half a mile from where the shirt was found, in a completely different direction, at the edge of a glacial stream, Andrew's boots were lying on the ground. Heavy hiking boots, as if someone had thrown them on the ground. There were no footprints around them, no bare feet, no other footprints. The ground was wet and any footprints would have been visible, but there were none. The 2 discoveries, made just 1 day apart, not only failed to help the investigation, but also brought it to a complete standstill. Imagine the scene. A guy's shirt found under heavy rocks in one place, and half a mile away, on the other side, his boots. Between these 2 points was rough terrain, thick brush, sharp rocks, and icy streams. The idea that Andrew had taken off his shirt himself, weighed it down with boulders, and then walked half a mile barefoot across this terrain to take off his boots and disappear seemed absurd. FBI investigators and park rangers were faced with a puzzle that had no solution. Let's examine the main theories and why none of them are effective. Theory 1, accident. This was the first and most obvious theory, but the findings disproved it. A person in distress, for example someone who fell and was injured, would not waste energy hiding their clothes under rocks and neatly arranging their shoes. In addition, their body or backpack would have been somewhere nearby. But a thorough search of the area, including crevices and bodies of water, turned up nothing. Version 2, attack by a wild animal. Black bears and grizzlies are found in Kenai Fjords National Park. A bear attack is always a brutal and bloody spectacle. It leaves behind torn clothing, blood, and apparent signs of a struggle. None of this was found. The shirt was intact. The boots were untouched. No predator is capable of such deliberate and strange manipulation of its victim's belongings. Version 3, kidnapping and murder. This version became the main one after the shirt was found under the rocks. The weight of the boulders indicated the involvement of third parties. Perhaps Andrew witnessed something illegal. Maybe he encountered criminals on the trail. But here too, the logic breaks down. Why would the killers create such a complex and bizarre still life out of the victim's belongings? Usually, criminals try to get rid of the body and evidence as quickly and discreetly as possible. They don't waste time dragging heavy stones or carefully placing shoes half a mile away from another piece of evidence. This does not hide the traces, but instead draws attention to them and creates a mystery. The Keene family had no enemies. They were an ordinary middle-class family, which ruled out kidnapping for ransom. Version 4, voluntary disappearance or suicide. Friends and family unanimously claimed that Andrew was a completely normal guy who was passionate about his hobby. He had plans for the future, including applying to college to study art. He had no history of depression or suicidal tendencies. But even if we assume a sudden mental breakdown, this does not explain the physical impossibility of moving those rocks alone. Ranger David Rusk, who led the search, said in an unofficial interview 10 years later, "In 30 years of working for the Park Service, I've seen dozens of tragedies. People fall off cliffs, drown in rivers, freeze to death in blizzards, or are killed by bears. Each of these deaths leaves a mark subject to the laws of physics. There is always logic, albeit cruel. In Kane's case, there was no logic. It felt like we were dealing with something that operated according to completely different rules that were alien to us. This wasn't just a murder, it was like some statement, but we couldn't read it." The search continued for another 2 weeks, but to no avail. Neither Andrew's backpack nor the Canon camera he used to take his last photo was ever found. This is particularly tragic. The only thing that could have shed light on the last moments of his life, the image on the film, disappeared with him. What happened? We will never know. Perhaps Andrew did encounter people, and what they did with his belongings was the result of drugs or a cruel, twisted mind. Maybe something even stranger happened beyond our comprehension. But the facts remain: a shirt buried under heavy rocks, boots standing alone half a mile away, and no trace of the man who strayed from the group for just a moment to capture the beauty of the glacier. That beauty was the last thing he ever saw. And his story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries have no answers, leaving behind only emptiness and unanswered questions. That's all, folks. The mysterious disappearances in Alaska remain unsolved, and each new story only reinforces the feeling that these lands hold secrets that are best left untold. If you found this interesting, like, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you find the most mysterious. There are even more creepy and inexplicable cases ahead. Don't miss them. Alaska is not just a land of glaciers and endless forests. It is a place where people disappear as if the earth itself swallows them up. Tourists, scientists, entire families, they venture into the wild and never return. There, torn tents are found with no signs of a struggle, backpacks hanging from treetops, shoes with the laces removed, and belongings neatly arranged in places where no human could have reached them. And every time, there are no clues or answers. What are these lands hiding? Why do experienced tourists and explorers who know all the rules of survival disappear without a trace in the mountains and tundra? Today, we will tell you about 3 disappearances, each of which became not just a tragedy, but a mystery that frightens even the most seasoned rescuers. Let's start with the story of Fred Larson, an engineer and experienced traveler, who in the summer of 1987 set out on a solo hike at the foot of Mount Ilia and was never seen again. Fred Larson was 36 years old. He was no stranger to the wilderness. A civil engineer from Oregon, he spent every vacation in the mountains. He was an experienced solo hiker, methodical and cautious. He knew how to read a map, how to handle a weapon, and most importantly, how to respect the wilderness. Alaska was his lifelong dream. In June 1987, he finally realized it when he flew into Port Allsworth. This tiny village serves as the gateway to Lake Clark National Park. His plan was ambitious but feasible for someone of his skill level. A 3-day solo hike along a little-known route at the foot of Mount Ilia. On the morning of June 14th, he checked in at the ranger station as required. He left a copy of his itinerary, indicated his expected return date, June 17th, and slinging his well-worn backpack over his shoulder, set off. When Fred didn't return on the 17th, no one panicked. In places like this, a day or two delay is typical. A small river can swell after rain and cut off the way back. A slight illness can force a tourist to wait out the day in a tent. But when he didn't show up on the 19th and his name didn't appear on the list of passengers departing from Port Allsworth, the Rangers sounded the alarm. The search operation began from the air. Pilots of small planes circled for hours over Fred's presumed route, scanning the endless green carpet of the taiga. It was an almost hopeless task. Finding one person in this ocean of trees was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Days passed with no results. Hope faded with each sunrise. Then, on the 10th day after his disappearance on June 24th, the pilot of one of the search planes spotted something. It was a small, barely discernible patch of unnatural color in a forest clearing. When the helicopter with the rescuers landed nearby, they realized they had found Fred's camp, and what they saw immediately alarmed them. The small single-person tent stood on level ground, but one of its walls had been torn open. It was not a neat cut made with a knife. The fabric was torn and stretched as if something large and powerful had broken through it. Inside the tent was a mess. An empty sleeping bag lay crumpled at the entrance, as if someone had jumped out of it in a panic, in an instant. A flashlight lay nearby, still on. The batteries were dead, but the switch was in the on position. This suggested that something had happened during the night, but the strangest thing was what wasn't in the tent. There were no traces of blood, no scraps of clothing. There were no signs of a struggle inside, and more importantly, there were no traces around the tent. The ground was covered with soft moss that would have preserved any footprints, from a heavy human boot or a bear's paw. But the moss was untouched. It seemed that whatever had torn the tent apart had not walked on the ground. Experienced rangers immediately thought of a grizzly bear. The tear in the tent looked like a claw mark. A sudden awakening in the night, panic. It all fit. They began combing the area for signs of the predator. They found nothing. Not a single paw print. Not a single scratch on the trees. No droppings. Nothing to indicate the presence of a large animal in the area. Then one of the rescuers, scanning the edge of the forest, looked up and froze. "Guys, you should take a look at this," he said over the radio, his voice filled with bewilderment. About 50 feet from the camp, at the very top of a tall old spruce tree, hung Fred's backpack. It was hanging at least 30 feet high. One of its straps was neatly hooked onto a sharp piece of broken branch near the trunk. The backpack hadn't been thrown up there. It would have gotten tangled in the lower branches. It had been placed there deliberately. The backpack at the top of the tree became the central element of this mystery. It wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a symbol of the absolute irrationality of what had happened. To reach it, one of the most experienced rangers, a professional tree climber, had to use special equipment. When he lowered the backpack to the ground, the mysteries deepened. First, the tree trunk was smooth without any hooks or scratches. There were no traces of bear claws that could have climbed up there. There were also no traces of climbing equipment or human boots. No one and nothing had climbed this tree from the ground. Second, the contents of the backpack. It was almost complete. Inside were Fred's documents, his wallet with money, a route map, a compass, a lighter, and a small supply of food. Everything was there. This ruled out robbery, but most importantly, his Ruger Super Blackhawk .44 caliber revolver was in its holster, in the side pocket. It was a powerful weapon, capable of stopping a bear. It had not been used. All 6 bullets were still there. The man who had panicked and rushed out of the tent at night did not take the weapon with him, which was in his backpack. Instead, the backpack somehow ended up on top of a tree. The official version of the bear attack began to fall apart. Yes, a bear could have torn the tent apart, but it wouldn't have hung the backpack neatly on a tree. It would have torn it to shreds in search of food. It would have left traces. And surely, if a bear had dragged Fred away, there would have been drag marks and blood on the ground. But there was none of that. The search continued with renewed vigor, now with a focus on the criminal angle. Perhaps Fred had encountered poachers or illegal miners, but this version did not explain the key details. Why would criminals kill a tourist and then spend time and effort hanging his backpack on a tree? It was a senseless and risky move. Days turned into weeks. Search parties combed the area square by square. Then, 3 weeks after the camp was discovered, a group of volunteers made their final discovery. About a mile from the camp, in a marshy hollow, they found Fred's hiking boot. It was half submerged in the mud. It was laced up. The foot inside was missing. Forensic experts examined the boot and found no teeth or claw marks. The leather was intact. The foot had simply been removed without damaging the boot. That was the last thing ever found belonging to Fred Larson. His body was never found. The case was at a dead end. Despite all the inconsistencies, the official conclusion was missing, presumed dead, as a result of a bear attack. It was a convenient and straightforward explanation that allowed the case to be closed, but none of those who worked on the case believed it. In private conversations, the Rangers discussed another, far more disturbing possibility. They talked about something else living in those woods, not a bear and not a man. The local Danina Indians tell legends of hairy people, or Nantunik, creatures that look like humans but are covered in fur, possess enormous strength and can move through the forest without leaving a trace. They are known for occasionally stealing from people or spying on them from a distance. They are usually not aggressive, but sometimes. Could something like this have taken an interest in Fred's camp? Could it have used its strength to tear down the tent and then, out of curiosity or some kind of incomprehensible logic, throw the backpack up into a tree? This version explains the lack of footprints, if the creature moved through the trees, the incredible height at which the backpack was found, and why no weapons were used. Perhaps it all happened so quickly that Fred simply didn't have time to react. We will never know the truth. The story of Fred Larson is not just a report about a missing tourist. It is a story about an encounter with something that does not fit into our picture of the world. Something powerful, intelligent, but operating according to a logic entirely alien to us. Something that can tear your refuge apart, and then, as if to mock you, hang your backpack on top of a tree, leaving rescuers and investigators completely baffled. But these are just guesses from a myth, with no objective evidence to back them up. Dr. Samuel Holloway was a man of science. As a field biologist specializing in Arctic ecosystems, he was accustomed to order, data, and logical conclusions. Nature was a complex but knowable system to him. In September 1995, he and his 17-year-old son Elias set up a small research camp in the upper reaches of the Noatak River. Their task was to collect samples of mosses and lichens to study the effects of climate change. For Samuel, it was work. For Elias, it was an adventure. He had grown up on such trips, was experienced and responsible beyond his years, had an excellent sense of direction in the wilderness, and was an indispensable assistant to his father. October 3rd was unusually calm for that time of year. A light snow fell during the day, covering the tundra with a thin, pristine layer several inches thick. By evening, the sky had cleared and there was no wind. The temperature dropped to 24.8 degrees, cool, but quite comfortable for Alaska. Father and son finished their work, had dinner in their heated tent, and prepared to process the day's samples. Around 7 in the evening, Elias got up and said he wanted to take a short walk. "I'll walk over to the weather station and check the gauges. I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said. The weather station was only a couple of hundred yards from the camp, a simple structure consisting of a tripod and a few instruments. It was a routine, daily task. Elias put on his boots and a warm jacket and left the tent. Samuel, absorbed in his work, didn't notice how time had passed. When he looked up from the microscope and glanced at his watch, it was almost 8. Elias was still not back. Samuel stepped outside the tent. The silence was absolute. Not just silence, but a vacuum. There was no sound of wind, no cry of a night bird, no rustling of grass. This ringing, unnatural silence made him feel uneasy for the first time. He called out his son's name. There was no answer. He grabbed a powerful flashlight and followed the tracks. They were clearly visible in the fresh snow, clear prints of his son's boots. The first thing Samuel noticed as a scientist was the nature of the tracks. They were perfectly straight. The steps were even, confident, with no signs of haste or panic. Elias didn't zigzag or look around. He walked in a straight line as if following a ruler toward a small stream flowing nearby. And here, at the very edge of this stream, Samuel Holloway, a man who believed in the laws of physics, encountered the impossible. His son's footprints led to the water's edge and ended. The stream was narrow, about 15 feet across. Due to the recent frost, it was completely frozen to the bottom. The ice was smooth, solid, and most importantly, covered with the same untouched layer of fresh snow. There was not a single footprint on it, nor were there any on the opposite bank. Samuel shone his flashlight in all directions. Elias's footprints did not veer to the left or right. They did not lead back. There were no signs that he had slipped or fallen. There were no dents, no traces of a struggle, nothing. Just a straight chain of footprints that reached the frozen creek and ended as if Elias had taken off vertically at that point. Overcome with horror, but still trying to think logically, Samuel crossed the creek back and forth several times. The ice was as hard as rock. He walked hundreds of yards up and down the stream. Nothing. Not a single crack, not a single gully where he could have fallen through. Not a single footprint on the other bank. Returning to the last footprint, he shone his flashlight on it again and again, trying to find some kind of explanation. But there was no explanation. That night, Samuel Holloway did not sleep. He heated up all the flares they had and fired them into the black, starless sky every half hour. In the morning, as soon as the satellite phone picked up a signal, he contacted the rescue service. His voice was calm, and he spoke like a scientist, stating facts. But behind that calmness lay the chilling horror of a father whose reality had been shattered. The rescue team arrived by helicopter at noon. It was led by Frank McGregor, a veteran of search and rescue operations in Alaska. He listened to Samuel's disjointed but accurate account and immediately headed for the creek. What he saw shocked even him. In 20 years on the job, he had seen dozens of tragic and strange cases, but never anything like this. It was like a picture from a magic trick, he said later. There were tracks, there was a barrier, and then nothing. Complete emptiness. We documented and photographed every inch. We brought dogs with us. And that was the strangest thing. 2 experienced search dogs confidently picked up the trail from the camp. They followed Elias's tracks precisely. But at the creek, where the tracks ended, the dogs stopped dead in their tracks. They began to whine, spin around, and then, with their tails tucked between their legs, tried to run back. They couldn't pick up the trail any further. They couldn't smell him on the ice, on the other bank, or in the air. Their behavior indicated not just a loss of the trail, but complete confusion and even fear. It was as if the source of the scent had simply ceased to exist at that point in space. The search continued for 6 days. Rescuers, volunteers, and rangers combed the area square by square. They found nothing, not a single clue, not a single discarded item. The weather, as luck would have it, was clear and calm, which made the lack of results even more ominous. Samuel Holloway, remaining at the camp, was slowly going mad with helplessness. He, a man who knew this nature, understood that his son could not have simply gotten lost. Something else had happened. On the 7th day, a helicopter pilot flying over the higher slopes spotted a piece of dark fabric on a gray scree slope. It was about 400 yards from the stream, but much higher up the hill, up a steep, difficult slope, where there was no point in going from where Elias had disappeared. The ground team reached the spot a few hours later. It was Elias's jacket, a heavy, warm parka. It wasn't just lying on the rocks. It was caught on a sharp ledge and covered with small stones. The jacket was dirty, stained with a dark substance, possibly mud or sludge despite the absence of nearby swamps, and it was torn. 3 long, parallel tears gaped on the back and sleeve. Experts who examined it later concluded that the tears did not resemble the marks left by the teeth or claws of a bear or wolf. The fabric had not been cut but torn, as if it had been stretched with incredible force in different directions. This discovery completely destroyed all rational explanations. Did she fall through the ice? The ice was intact? Was she attacked by an animal? There were no signs of a struggle, no blood. The dogs behaved strangely, and there was unusual damage to the jacket. Did she leave on her own? The tracks were straight and broke off. Why would he walk up a steep slope in the dark without a jacket in 4-degree frost? It defies the instinct for self-preservation. Kidnapping by a human, in one of the wildest and most deserted places on the planet, without a single trace of anyone else in the snow? Absurd. The phenomenon of paradoxical undressing, which sometimes occurs in severe hypothermia, didn't fit either. Elias had been gone too short a time to freeze to that extent, and it didn't explain how he had covered 400 yards of snow and rocks without leaving a single trace. The search was called off after 2 weeks. Elias Holloway was never found. The official report was short and vague, missing in the wilderness. In private conversations, rescuers said the case left them with a heavy feeling, a feeling of touching something beyond their experience and understanding. Samuel Holloway left Alaska a month later. He never returned to field work. A man of science, he was left alone with a set of data that was impossible to systematize. A straight line of footprints in the snow leading to nothingness, the unnatural silence that enveloped the camp, and a torn jacket on a cold mountainside. These three facts shattered his world. The story of Elias Holloway became another quiet, unsolvable chapter in the vast book of unexplained disappearances. It serves as a reminder that in the great silence of the wilderness, there are phenomena for which humanity has yet to find laws or explanations. There are only questions and traces that end at a frozen stream. The Noatak National Wildlife Refuge in northwestern Alaska is one of the last truly wild places on the planet. It is not a park in the usual sense, with trails and campgrounds. It is 6.5 million acres of pristine, untouched land, where the geography still seems temporary and the presence of humans fleeting and out of place. In this land of rivers, mountains, and endless tundra, there are places where no human has ever set foot. And it was here, in the heart of this silence, that the Tom family arrived in the summer of 1981 to take the trip of their dreams. They did not know that this journey would turn into a never-ending nightmare, and that the name of their son, Arlen, would be added to the quiet but eerie list of those whom this land took without leaving a trace or an answer. Ray and Janice Tom were no strangers to adventure. Ray, a 42-year-old geologist, had spent most of his life on field expeditions. Janice, his 40-year-old wife, was a high school biology teacher and an avid hiker. Their 14-year-old son, Arlen, was the product of their love for the wilderness. From early childhood, they took him with them, teaching him how to pitch a tent, build a fire, read a map, and most importantly, respect and understand a world where humans are only guests. Arlen was a quiet, observant teenager who preferred the silence of the forest to the noise of the city. A trip down the Cougarak River in the Noatak National Wildlife Refuge was to be his first severe, almost adult test. They had been preparing for this trip for nearly a year. They carefully studied maps, bought the best equipment available at the time, and planned their route. In early August 1981, a small seaplane dropped them off on the riverbank, where they began their journey. The first 2 days were exactly as they had imagined. Difficult crossings, breathtaking landscapes, and a feeling of complete unity with nature and with each other. They saw grizzly bears from a safe distance and herds of caribou passing through the tundra. Everything was going according to plan. On the evening of the third day, they set up camp on a dry, grassy spit by the river. The day was clear and warm. Ray built a fire while Janice prepared dinner. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in incredible shades of orange and purple. They ran out of drinking water. Arlen, as he had done many times before, took 2 empty mess kits and a headlamp, even though it was still light enough. "I'll go to the river and get some water," he said. The river was only 30 yards from the tent, and its sound was clearly audible. "Okay, just be careful near the shore, it's slippery," Janice replied, without looking up from her cooking. "I'll be quick," Arlen said, and disappeared behind the low willow bushes growing near the water. Those were the last words they heard from him. 15 minutes in the everyday world is nothing. In the Alaskan wilderness at sunset, it can be an eternity. For the first 5 minutes, Ray and Janice weren't worried, but when 10 minutes passed and Arlen still hadn't returned, Ray put down the wood and called out, "Arlen, are you okay?" The only response was the sound of the river and the crackling of the fire. Janice felt a chill run down her spine. "Maybe he just decided to wash the pots," she said to her husband, but there was no confidence in her voice. When 15 minutes had passed, Ray grabbed his flashlight. "I'll go check," he said. He reached the water's edge in a minute. There was no one on the pebble beach. 2 pots stood at the water's edge, filled to the brim. Arlen was gone. Ray shone his flashlight around on the other side of the river. Nothing. He shouted his son's name, and his cry, full of alarm, was drowned out by the sound of the water. Janice ran up to him, her face white with fear. Together they began to comb the shore, looking into every shadow, every clump of bushes. They shouted his name over and over until they were hoarse. But there was no answer. The ground by the river was rocky and there were no footprints. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of blood, nothing that could indicate an animal attack. Their son, their 14-year-old boy, had simply disappeared, walking 30 yards away from the camp to fetch water. They didn't sleep that night. They built a massive fire and fired flares into the air. At dawn, Ray, following a prearranged emergency plan, turned on their emergency radio beacon, and the agonizing wait began. Rescuers were unable to reach them until late the next day. After listening to the disjointed story of the grief-stricken parents, they began a systematic search. The first 2 days yielded absolutely nothing. It seemed as if the boy had vanished into thin air. All hope rested on the canine search team, which arrived on the 3rd day of the search. It was then that this story began to turn from tragic to inexplicable. 2 specially trained German shepherds, designed for searching for people in the wild, easily picked up Arlen's trail near the tent. But the trail did not lead them to the river where the pots were. It led them in the opposite direction, to thick, almost impenetrable thickets of willow and alder, about 100 yards from the camp. The dogs followed the trail confidently, and the rescuers were already preparing to find the boy, wounded or frightened in the bushes. But about 10 yards before reaching the thicket, both dogs stopped abruptly. Their behavior changed in an instant. They whimpered, and the hair on their necks stood on end. They began to resist, refusing to go any further. The dog handlers, experienced professionals, tried to get them to move, but the dogs fell into a state close to panic. They growled, not at anything in particular, but at the thicket itself, and backed away, trying to break free from their collars. The rescuers were puzzled. They had never seen such a reaction. The dogs were not afraid of the smell of a bear or a wolf. They were trained to work in such conditions. They were fearful of something else, something that caused their instinct for self-preservation to completely override all commands. Arlen's trail led straight to these thickets, and then, judging by the dog's reaction, it either broke off or mixed with something that caused them to panic. After combing through the thickets foot by foot, the people found nothing. No traces, no clues, no Arlen. The search operation had reached its first, most bizarre impasse. The failure of the canine calculations was a turning point in the case of Arlen Tom's disappearance. Until that moment, the rescuers had been dealing with a tragic but potentially explainable situation. Now they were faced with something that did not fit into their years of experience. The atmosphere in the search camp changed. The professionalism remained, but it was mixed with an oppressive sense of anxiety, a feeling that they had entered a territory where different rules applied. The search became more cautious, with people looking around more often, listening to the silence between gusts of wind. On the 4th day of the search, one of the groups was methodically combing a wooded slope about half a mile from the camp. It was routine, exhausting work. Then one of the volunteers, a former soldier named Mike, stopped and looked up. Against the gray sky, he noticed a dark spot on the branch of a tall spruce tree. It was too regular in shape to be a nest or a cluster of pine needles. Using binoculars, he confirmed his hunch. It was a headlamp. The find was strange from the start. The headlamp was hanging from a thick, bare branch about 8 feet high. It hadn't just been thrown there. An elastic strap had been carefully looped over the branch, as if someone had taken it off their head and hung it up. To do that, someone as tall as Arlen would have had to either jump or climb something. But the ground beneath the tree was covered with a thick layer of untouched moss. There were no footprints, no broken branches. The tree trunk was smooth, with no scratches that boots would have left while climbing. The switch on the lantern was in the off position. This detail was alarming. A person lost in the woods at night does not turn off their only source of light, and certainly not hang it on a high branch where it would be difficult to reach. This action was devoid of survival logic. It was more like a ritual or a sign. But what did it mean? The rescuers searched every inch around the tree. There was nothing. No traces, no other items. Only this lone flashlight hanging silently above their heads. The search continued. Ray and Janice, whose faces had turned into gray masks of grief over the past few days, refused to leave the camp. They clung to a faint hope. But with each passing day, that hope faded, giving way to cold, sticky despair. On the 9th day, when the official search was about to be called off, another team made a final discovery. Far from where the lantern had been found, in thick bushes at the foot of an old tree, lay a boot, Arlen's boot. It was dry and clean, except for a few leaves stuck to it. It was not torn or damaged. The laces were completely untied. It lay as if it had been carefully removed and placed in the bushes. There was no sign of the other boot anywhere nearby. And again, as in the previous cases, there were absolutely no traces around it. This discovery was the last straw. It added another element to the picture that is characteristic of the strangest cases of disappearance: paradoxical undressing. But this did not resemble the actions of a person in hypothermia who, in agony, tears off their clothes. It was methodical. The flashlight was turned off and hung up. The boot was removed, unlaced, and placed back in its place. Every action was deliberate. But whose? 2 weeks later, the active search was called off. Arlen Tom was listed as missing. Ray and Janice left Noatak, taking with them a void that would never be filled. The official report, compiled later, was full of omissions and assumptions. The most likely version was an attack by a predator, despite the complete lack of evidence. It was the only way to close a case that had no rational solution. But the story did not end there. A year passed. The name Arlen Tom became another quiet tragedy in the history of Alaska. In the fall of 1982, a commercial hunter, an Inupiat Indian, was checking his traps in an area rarely visited even by locals. He was dozens of miles from the Tom family camp. To get there, he had to cross a river and climb a high, wind-swept plateau, a rocky desert where almost nothing grew. No tourist trails led to this place. Passing between two huge boulders covered with lichen, the hunter noticed a glint on the ground. He bent down and picked up the object. It was a simple handmade bracelet woven from colored threads and decorated with a small metal bead. Later, Janice Tom would recognize it. It was a gift she had made for her son on his 14th birthday, the bracelet he had never taken off. It lay on the ground exactly between two boulders, as if it had been placed there on purpose. The hunter, a man who had grown up in these parts and knew the language of nature, looked around. There were no bones, no scraps of clothing, no other signs of human presence. Only this small, man-made object in the heart of a vast, indifferent desert, on a plateau where a 14-year-old boy, even if he had survived, would never have been able to reach. This last discovery became the most chilling epilogue to the story of Arlen Tom. It confirmed once and for all that his disappearance was not the result of blind chance or a predator. It was a series of deliberate actions that were utterly alien to human logic. Water pots left by the river, a scent leading to bushes that dogs fear, a lantern hung 8 feet high, a single shoe, and finally a bracelet carried dozens of miles and left on top of a desert plateau. It didn't look like someone was covering their tracks. It looked like a chain of inexplicable details, a grim exhibition where the boy's personal belongings served as exhibits. It was as if some force or creature had not simply taken him away. Still methodically, step by step, he was dismantled, leaving his parents and rescuers with these unsolvable mysteries as the only thing they had left of their son. We will never know what happened to Arlen Tom during those 15 minutes by the Kugarak River. This story makes even the most ardent skeptics believe in something else. And that's it. These stories are just a small part of what Alaska hides. Here, people disappear in such a way that even experienced trackers and rescuers throw up their hands in despair. Logic breaks down, theories don't add up, and the clues found seem like a mockery of the human mind. If you liked the video, like it, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories you think is the scariest. There are more investigations and unexplained disappearances ahead. Don't miss them. See you next time. Alaska is a place where nature itself seems to keep its secrets and is in no hurry to share them with humans. The stories of Simon Clark, Wayne Malone, and Maria Hopper are just 3 chapters in a long book of disappearances that cannot be explained by conventional logic. A neatly rolled sleeping bag by a cliff, a boat with scratches on the bottom, glasses on a tree, a bag with blood stains at the roots. All these clues look as if they were left there on purpose, like a riddle that no one has solved. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and share your comments. Your participation inspires new videos. Now let's move on to inexplicable stories that leave more questions than answers. Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska is a place that inspires awe in and of itself. The largest national park in the United States, covering more than 13 million acres, it is a place where glaciers slide into narrow valleys and peaks over 16,000 feet high tower over the tundra and nameless streams. Here, humans are always guests, and more often than not, they are casual passers-by, almost invisible against the backdrop of the gigantic natural landscape. It was here in June 1992 that a 39-year-old Washington state resident named Simon Clark arrived. He was not a professional climber or geologist by training. Still, since his youth, he had been fascinated by cartography, rocks, and field expeditions. His home in Seattle was filled with boxes of rock samples, carefully labeled and arranged by year. For him, geology was not a profession but a passion, a way of understanding the world. That year, he planned a trip to the Nebezna Glacier, one of the most inaccessible places in Wrangell Cordillera National Park. His plan was relatively simple. A seaplane would take him to Lake Tana on June 15th. From there, he wanted to walk along the southern edge of the glacier, take a series of photographs, collect samples, and return to the lake by the 19th, where the pilot was to pick him up. Simon was born in 1953 in Tacoma, Washington. He was an electrical engineer by profession, but whenever he had the opportunity, he would head for the mountains. Friends described him as methodical, but sometimes overly confident in his abilities. He did not drink or smoke, always planned his routes carefully, and never went on a hike without leaving a note with his itinerary. For his trip to Alaska, he bought new equipment: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, climbing boots, and a navigation kit consisting of a USGS map and a compass. He did not have a satellite beacon, such devices were still rare in 1992, but he always used simple methods to mark his route: bright ribbons, pieces of cloth on branches and cairns. His family and friends noted, Simon always left traces. He considered it his #1 safety rule. On June 15, 1992, a de Havilland Beaver seaplane took him to Lake Tana. Pilot George Wallace later said that Clark looked excited and focused. He checked his backpack, carefully secured his tent, and waved goodbye to the pilot. At that moment, there was no sign of trouble. Then there was silence. When the plane returned to the lake to pick him up on June 19th, Clark was nowhere to be found. There were no traces of a campfire or a tent on the shore. The pilot made several flyovers, nothing. A report was then filed with the National Park Service. The search began quickly. Rangers, pilots, and volunteers participated in the operation. The weather was cold, with rain and low clouds. For the first 2 days, the group searched the area around Lake Tana, to no avail. No tents, no stone cairns, no characteristic ribbons that Clark always used to mark his route were found. This immediately raised alarm bells. Clark never traveled without leaving markers. His friends who were involved in the search insisted that he was too disciplined to make such a mistake. But the terrain behaved differently. It was as if his presence had been erased. On the 5th day of the search, June 24th, volunteers stumbled upon a sleeping bag. It lay neatly rolled up on a stone platform near a cliff, 6 miles east of the lake. The sleeping bag was dry and clean, as if it had just been taken out of a tent and placed on the ground. There were no other belongings nearby: no tent, no backpack, no clothes. There were not even any traces of a campfire. The ground around it was wet from rain, but the sleeping bag was dry, as if it had been placed there very recently. Another oddity: a few yards from the find, there were faint traces of a grizzly bear, but they did not lead to the sleeping bag, but away from it, gradually disappearing into the grass. The ranger's report later noted, "It has not been determined why the sleeping bag was left in such an open place, with no signs of anyone having been there." The Clark family was particular that if he had folded the sleeping bag himself, he would have done so at the camp or on the trail, but not on the edge of a cliff. After the sleeping bag was found, the search continued with renewed vigor. The National Park Service brought in additional teams. 2 helicopter crews, dog handlers, and about 30 volunteers who were experienced hikers. The primary focus was on the area along the Nebezna Glacier. It seemed apparent that this was where Clark might have headed, and that this was where his markers should have been. However, to the astonishment of all involved, no markers were found. Not a single ribbon, not a single rope, not even a twig bent by a human hand. It was as if Simon had moved cleanly, leaving no trace. This was entirely out of character for him. His sister Carol, who flew to Alaska, later said, "If you walk through the woods and don't see any markers, then it's not Simon. He couldn't have forgotten. It's part of his character." The search then took on an almost mystical tone. On June 29th, 2 weeks after his disappearance, a group of volunteers found a boot about 7 miles northeast of the lake. It was a solo climbing boot, in good condition, with the laces intact and minimal signs of wear. But the way it was found shocked everyone. The boot was in a narrow crevice between 2 rocks. It hadn't just fallen there, but seemed to have been stuck there with force. It was stuck vertically, toe down, so deep that it could only be pulled out with the help of a crowbar. The outside of the boot was relatively dry, while the inside was damp, but showed no signs of prolonged exposure to rain. There was no body or other items nearby, no socks, no backpack, no traces of human presence. Only this boot, stuck in such a way that it seemed as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Experts immediately noted that if the boot had simply fallen off the foot during a fall or while walking, it would have remained on the surface. To achieve that level of depth, considerable effort would have been required. By this point, the search operation had been going on for more than 2 weeks. No tent, no backpack, no other pieces of clothing, no blood, no bones, no personal belongings. The traces on the ground ended abruptly, as if the man had ceased to exist in that place. Biologists from the University of Alaska, called in for consultation, ruled out a bear attack. An attack always leaves traces of a struggle: fur, scraps of clothing, blood. There is nothing here. Dog handlers came to the same conclusion. The dogs picked up Simon's scent only on a short stretch near the lake, but then lost it completely. Special attention was paid to the question of route markers. Simon's relatives and friends insisted that he never traveled without leaving marks, but this time there were none. A hypothesis arose. Perhaps he deliberately removed them, deciding to keep his route a secret. But why? And why then was his sleeping bag neatly rolled up at the edge of the cliff and his boot stuck in a crevice? Simon's sister Carol and 2 friends flew to Alaska to join the search. They noted several oddities that were not included in the official reports but were discussed among a small group of volunteers. Several searchers indicated that there was an unnatural silence in the area where the sleeping bag was found. No birds were singing, not even the sound of the wind. "It was as if the sound had disappeared," said one of the rangers. 2 volunteers claimed to have smelled a strong metallic odor, like rust or blood, although there were no animal remains or traces of a fire nearby. The search dogs refused twice to go beyond a certain point on the trail, growling and backing away. This was recorded in the search team's log, but the official reports emphasized the lack of traces for analysis. For the Clark family, the main shock was that he seemed to have disappeared completely. No documents, no knife, not even a mug, although usually at least some of a tourist's belongings are found. Only 2 items were found here: a sleeping bag and a boot. The official investigation ultimately came to a cautious conclusion. The cause of Simon Clark's disappearance could not be established. Animal attack and accident have been ruled out as unlikely. There were various unofficial versions. Falling into a crevasse. Some believed that Clark could have walked onto the glacier and fallen into a crevasse that was covered by snow. This would explain the absence of a body, but it does not explain why his sleeping bag was found rolled up at the edge of a cliff, and his boot was found crushed in a crevasse 7 miles away. Another theory was that he wanted to disappear and start a new life. But some things spoke against this. He left his documents, money, and his beloved mineral collection at home. There were no signs that he wanted to disappear. Sometimes the possibility of foul play was discussed. Someone could have encountered him in the mountains. But the area was completely deserted. Not a single camp was recorded within a 30-mile radius during those days. A search for volunteers from among supporters of anomalous hypotheses gathered a collection of similar stories from Alaska, people whose traces had been lost, whose belongings had been found neatly folded in illogical places. In 1993 and 1994, repeated searches were conducted during the warmer months. Volunteers searched riverbeds, rock slides, and even caves in the rock formations, but again nothing. Simon Clark's relatives only achieved official recognition of his death in 1997, 5 years after his disappearance. But neither they nor many of the searchers could accept that a man had simply vanished, leaving behind only 2 items that looked as if they had been deliberately placed there by someone. To this day, no one knows where Simon Clark ended up on that June day in 1992. In July 1996, a 42-year-old fisherman from Utah named Wayne Malone disappeared in Clark Lake National Park. He rented a small cabin for a week and told the owner by radio that he was going fishing on the morning of July 14th. He did not return that evening. The search began the next day. Almost immediately, his boat was found 3 miles downstream. It was intact, the motor was in working order, but the key had been removed, as if someone had deliberately stalled the engine. Inside was a fishing rod, a bucket of fresh fish, and a neatly folded jacket. Strange, deep scratches, like fingernail marks, were found on the aluminium bottom, as if someone had desperately tried to hold on. Still, there were no other signs of a struggle or accident. When the boat was examined more closely, it became clear that the theory of falling overboard did not explain the details. If Malone really fell, why was the engine stopped manually? If he was thrown out, where were the marks on the shore or in the water? Rangers and volunteers flew over the entire area in helicopters and seaplanes. Boats combed the coastline and divers checked the most dangerous places. Still, no trace of a body was found. Dogs brought in to search confidently followed the trail from the cockpit to the shore, but at the spot where the boat was found, they lost the trail completely, as if the man had simply vanished. The case was becoming increasingly alarming. One of the rangers later recalled that in his years of service, he had seen dozens of accidents on the water, but this story immediately defied logic. It was as if someone had swept it away, he said. On the 4th day of the search, local residents joined the effort. It was then that volunteers made a discovery that only added to the sense of mystery surrounding the incident. In the fork of a tree, nearly 9 feet above the ground, lay Malone's sunglasses, neatly arranged. There were no human footprints or broken grass below. The glasses were intact, the lenses undamaged, and it looked as if they had been deliberately placed there. This detail baffled the searchers. Even experienced trackers could not explain how the item could have ended up in such a place. The bear attack theory was investigated immediately. In Alaska, this is always the first assumption. But no hair, blood, or characteristic paw prints were found around the boat. In addition, the fish in the bucket remained untouched, and it was unlikely that the animal would have ignored such easy prey. The idea that the man could have drowned was also not supported. The water in that area was not deep enough for the body not to float to the surface within a few days. Relatives insisted that Wayne had always been very organized. He had a habit of marking his route by making notches or leaving ribbons. This made his disappearance even stranger, as there was no sign that he had marked the trail. It seemed as if he had failed to do so for the first time in his life. By the end of July, the active search began to wind down. Dozens of people, from rangers to volunteers, combed the area, but all they found during that time was a boat with scratches on the bottom and a pair of glasses in a tree. Official reports dryly stated, "No logical explanation." For Malone's family and friends, it became unbearable. His disappearance turned into one of those Alaskan mysteries where every detail only adds to the sense of incomprehension, and obvious explanations fall apart at the first careful glance. When local newspapers began to write about the strange disappearance of a fisherman from Utah, interest in the case skyrocketed. Wayne Malone was known as a practical man with experience in hiking and fishing. His friends insisted that he never took unnecessary risks and treated nature with respect. For his family, the idea that he could have accidentally fallen into the water or died from stupidity seemed impossible. Relatives insisted on expanding the search, and then the FBI got involved, as the disappearance occurred within a national park and was accompanied by circumstances that did not fit the usual versions. All the materials were analyzed during August. The Rangers' report on the boat contained a note. The scratches on the bottom looked like they had been made by fingernails, but in the official document this was phrased more mildly as undetermined damage. The photos of the boat taken immediately after its discovery were never made public. Several searchers admitted in private conversations that what they saw was extremely disturbing. It looked as if a person had been in a panic and scratched the metal trying to stay inside. The glasses in the fork of a tree became the second unsolvable mystery. Investigators suggested that they could have been brought there by the wind or a bird. However, the glasses were heavy, with metal frames, and no bird could have placed them neatly in the fork. Moreover, no strong winds were reported in the area during the search. The FBI reports also mention this episode, but without attempting to explain it, they simply state that the item was found where it could not have ended up naturally. With each passing day, it became increasingly clear that Wayne's body would not be found. Usually, drowned bodies float to the surface within 3-5 days. Even assuming that he had been carried away by the current, the area searched covered dozens of miles down the river, and the chances of finding his remains were extremely high. But the search yielded absolutely nothing. There was no piece of clothing, no footprints, no bones, not even any objects that could have washed ashore. Everything disappeared with him. This disappearance was recorded as a case with no logical explanation. Journalists writing about it called it a case with no version. Against the backdrop of routine accidents and tourist deaths, the case seemed eerily empty. It was as if Malone's disappearance itself was pushing people to think that there was something more to it than a simple tragedy. All that remained for the family was speculation. His wife said that Wayne was a man of habit. He always packed his things neatly, and that was precisely what was found in the boat: a folded jacket, a fishing rod, and neatly caught fish. It looked as if he intended to return in a few minutes, but he never returned. In its annual report, the FBI listed Malone's case separately, with the note, "No signs of violence, no explanation." This is a rare wording, as usually at least the most likely cause is indicated: drowning, accident, animal attack. In this case, even that was not done. Over time, Wayne Malone's story became a local legend. Fishermen and residents of Lake Clark said that since then, they had become more cautious about going out alone. Several times, people claimed to have seen a boat slowly drifting without an owner, but when they approached, it was empty. This coincidence always reminded them of that July day in 1996. That's how it remained. A boat with scratches, neatly left belongings, glasses on a tree, and no body. For the record, it was an unexplained disappearance. For the family, it was an eternal question with no answer. For investigators of such cases, it was another story that fit into a long series of mysterious disappearances in Alaska, where nature seems to be able to hide people without a trace. The Tongass National Forest, the largest in the United States, covers more than 16 million acres. This place is a combination of misty fjords, cold streams, ancient fir trees, and mountains sloping down to the water. Tourists who come here often say that they feel cut off from the world. Phone service is rare, civilization seems far away, and nature itself seems to repel any human attempts to interfere with its rhythm. In July 1998, a 29-year-old traveler from Virginia named Maria Hopper arrived here. She was no stranger to camping. She had hiked the Appalachian Trail, spent nights in the Rocky Mountains, and traveled to western national parks. Her friends noted that Maria always took preparation seriously. She checked her equipment twice, kept her things in order, and always left a detailed itinerary when traveling alone. She arrived in Tongass as part of a more extended trip through Alaska. According to her family, the purpose of the trip was to listen to the silence and live in solitude for a few days. She rented a spot at a small campground near Sitka Creek, popular with fishermen and those who prefer short stays in the woods. There are only a few campsites, each surrounded by trees and overlooking the fast-flowing stream. According to their campsite neighbors, a couple from Seattle, Maria seemed calm and content on the evening of July 17th. They remembered her slender figure, her hair pulled back in a bun, and the harmonica she played by the campfire. It was around 9 p.m. The couple later recalled, "It sounded unexpectedly cozy. She was playing a simple melody and the whole forest seemed to freeze." They went to bed around 10:30 p.m., and when they woke up in the morning, they noticed the silence. There was no smoke from the campfire. Maria's tent looked open, and the girl herself was nowhere to be seen. At 8 a.m., they approached the tent. Inside, they found a backpack, neatly zipped up. A lantern lay on the ground nearby, turned off. The tent was unzipped, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. But there was no mess. There were no shoes or jackets. Everything remained in place, including food and documents. At first, they thought Maria had left early in the morning for a short walk, but with each passing minute, their concern grew. By noon, not having waited for her, they informed the campground manager, who contacted the rangers. A search began immediately. In the first few hours, the search party expected to find Maria's tracks right next to the camp. However, there was nothing around the tent, no footprints in the damp ground, no broken branches, no distinctive shoe marks. It was as if a person had simply vanished into the night. 200 yards from the camp, in an area with thick roots from an old fallen tree, they found the only item, a small hygiene bag wrapped in a gray t-shirt. Inside were soap, a toothbrush, and a comb. The t-shirt itself had brown stains, dried and blurred. There were traces of blood on the toothbrush. An examination later confirmed the presence of blood. Still, its origin could not be determined. At that time, DNA testing was not yet widely used for all such cases, and there was not enough material. The strangeness of the find added to the anxiety. Why did Maria leave at night without her shoes and jacket, leaving everything in the tent? Why did she take the bag with her toiletries but leave it next to the tree roots, wrapped in her t-shirt? And most importantly, whose blood was on the toothbrush? 3 days after her disappearance, heavy rains washed away any possible traces in the area around the stream. Search dogs were unable to pick up the scent more than a few dozen feet from the tent. Volunteers combed the stream bed, woods, and rocky areas, but the body or other belongings were never found. Neighbors at the camp emphasized in their statements that they had not heard any suspicious noises, screams, or footsteps. That night, there was almost complete silence. Their tent was only 160 feet from Maria's camp, and if something loud had happened, they would have heard it. But they heard nothing. The official report would later call it a disappearance under unknown circumstances. To Maria's family, that sounded hollow. She disappeared without a fight, without a trace, without an explanation, leaving behind only a harmonica by a dead campfire and a strange bag with bloodstains. The search for Maria Hopper continued for 2 weeks. Rangers, volunteers from local communities, search dogs, and even a helicopter from Sitka took part. But the more they searched the area, the less hope there was. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no personal belongings were found, except for the hygiene bag. It was as if the girl had simply walked out of the tent and vanished into thin air. The Sitka Creek near where her camp was located was searched particularly thoroughly. The water there is cold but not too deep. If Maria had accidentally slipped, her body would have been found downstream sooner or later. But that didn't happen. The slopes around the campsite were also searched, but no signs of a fall or accident were found. One of the volunteers who participated in the search recalled, "We were hoping for at least a small clue, a piece of fabric, a broken bush, but nothing. Just that shirt and the brush with blood on it. It didn't look right. It was as if someone had taken her out and left her there on purpose." Maria's family flew in from Virginia on the 3rd day after her disappearance. Her brother John said in an interview with a local newspaper, "Maria was always careful. She didn't go out barefoot at night, nor did she go far away alone. If she decided to go somewhere, she would have taken a flashlight and her boots. Something happened and we don't know what." Investigators put forward several theories. The first was that she left voluntarily, but all her belongings, including her documents and money, were left in the tent. Besides, why would she go at night without shoes? The second was an attack by a wild animal. but there were no signs of a struggle in or around the tent, and the blood-stained t-shirt found looked more like a rag that someone had used to wipe their hands. The third theory was an accident in the forest, but then they should have found a body, or at least signs of a fall, and the forest had been combed through dozens of times. In the archives, Maria Hopper's case remained unsolved. The documents stated explicitly, "No logical explanation for the behavior or the clues found." For the Tongass Rangers, her disappearance became one of the most puzzling cases of the decade. Over the years, the legend of the girl with the harmonica has become part of the oral history of the local residents. Tourists visiting the campground near Sitka Creek sometimes hear stories about how, on summer nights, a quiet melody can be heard in the distance, as if someone is playing a harmonica by the campfire. The facts remain the same. In July 1998, 29-year-old Maria Hopper sat down by the campfire in the evening, and in the morning she was gone. All that remained was her tent, a harmonica, and a strange bag with bloodstains. Everything else is just speculation. Her body was never found. That's all. If you found this interesting, subscribe, and write in the comments which of these stories struck you the most. There are even more creepy and inexplicable disappearances ahead that are impossible to explain. On one fateful evening in 1984, an entire expedition on Mount Everest disappeared without a trace. The radio at base camp, which had been picking up short messages all day, who was where, at what altitude, how the weather was changing, suddenly fell silent. A dead silence hung in the air, and in the communications tent, people whispered, "They seem to have died." To rescue them would mean losing even more people. The bodies of the daredevils were never found, as if the mountain had swallowed them forever. What happened on the western ridge of Everest? Why did everything go so wrong? Hristo Prodanov, or Iso, as his friends affectionately called him, was a man with two passions: the precise mind of a metallurgical engineer and the fiery soul of a mountaineer. He was born in 1943 in the picturesque Bulgarian town of Karlovo, at the foot of the rugged Balkan Mountains. From an early age, the peaks drew him like a magnet, determining his destiny and igniting in his heart a thirst for conquering heights. His path to mountaineering was rapid. He conquered the great northern walls of the Alps, including the Matterhorn and Grand Jorasses, and repeatedly climbed the 7,000ers of the Pamir and Hindu Kush. His incredible physical endurance earned him the nickname Iron Muscle. But his most outstanding achievement before Everest was the climb that defined his reputation and ultimately his destiny. In 1981, he became the first Bulgarian to climb Lhotse, the fourth highest mountain in the world. He did it alone and without the use of supplemental oxygen. This feat proved that he was capable of the most outstanding achievements in the purest and most difficult style. It was with this philosophy, a philosophy of individual strength and exceptional ambition, that he approached his ultimate goal, Everest. For their climb, the 1984 Bulgarian expedition chose not the standard route but the West Ridge, a path known for its fearsome reputation. It is longer, more technically challenging, and more exposed to fierce winds than the classic route. It is called the Cruel Route, and for good reason. Of more than 60 attempts, only 15 have been successful, but 20 climbers have died. The first ascent of this route was made in 1963 by Americans Tom Hornbein and Willie Ansold. Still, their success was the result of coordinated teamwork, and their survival depended on meeting their companions on the descent on the other, safer side of the mountain. Prodanov, however, was striving for something else. He wanted to join the pantheon of great solo climbers, such as Reinhold Messner, who conquered Everest alone from the north in 1980. This clash of philosophies, teamwork versus individual ambition, became the central conflict of the expedition. To understand the events of 1984, one must remember the time in which they took place. The Cold War was being fought on the slopes of the world's highest peaks. The successful ascent of Everest by the Bulgarian team was supposed to be a huge propaganda victory for socialist Bulgaria. This was not a private adventure, but a national project supported at the highest level. The pressure was enormous. Avram Avramov, a man with whom Prodanov had a long and complicated relationship, was appointed expedition leader. Many years earlier, Avramov had refused to take Prodanov on another expedition because of his stubborn nature. But now, after his triumph on Lhotse, it was Prodanov who insisted that Avramov lead the expedition to Everest, considering him the only one who could organize it. Avramov agreed, but on one condition. He would be the sole selector of the team. This led to the main disagreement that predetermined the tragedy. The official expedition plan called for a traverse, an ascent via the West Ridge and a descent via the safer classic route. It was a proven survival strategy, but Prodanov was categorically opposed. He was determined to ascend and descend via the cruel route. Later, Avramov would say outright that this was a violation of orders. He wanted to achieve what no one had ever achieved, recalled the expedition leader. At an altitude of more than 26,000 feet, each climber makes his own decisions, and the leader is powerless in the face of the unyielding will of a man in the death zone. The expedition began in 1984. April 20th was a clear but cold day. At 5:45 a.m., two climbers set out from the area of the future Camp 5, Hristo Prodanov and Sherpa Chovang Rinzi. They were climbing without oxygen. Below the summit, the Sherpa turned back. It had become too complicated. Hristo continued alone. At 11:10 a.m., he made contact. He was at approximately 8,500 meters and continuing his ascent. By evening, on April 20th at around 6:10 p.m., he reported that he was standing on the summit. He was the first Bulgarian to reach the summit of Everest, alone, without oxygen. He found empty oxygen tanks on the pyramid, with a flag nearby. He tore off a small piece of the flag. He left his small camera at the summit. Many did the same. It is a sign for those who follow and proof that you were really at the top. Next came the descent. Hristo did not take the more familiar route around the mountain. He turned around and descended along the same west ridge. At 9:10 p.m., he said briefly over the radio that it was too dark, and he would spend the night right on the ridge, without a tent, without oxygen, at an altitude of about 28,000 feet. Those below understood that this was extremely dangerous, but in the dark, taking another route was also risky. Waiting for daylight was the only option. In the morning of April 21st, his voice could still be heard. It was weak and some words were indistinguishable. There is an important detail. Hristo may have had problems with his gloves. At such an altitude, fingers quickly become numb, making it difficult to press the radio button or perform any hand movements. By 5:30 p.m., communication was still possible, but poor. At 7:45 p.m., the last click was recorded. After that, there was silence. On the same day, Lyudmil Yankov climbed to the top. He rose very high to about 8,500 meters, but found no trace of Hristo. He spent the night at about 8,400 meters, also without proper shelter. During the night, the weather deteriorated. A storm began higher up. It became clear that the risk now affected more than just one person. Anyone who went further might not return. It was at this moment that the phrase we began with was uttered below. The entire team could be lost at the top if the rescue continued at all costs. Let's break down April 20th step by step. This is important for understanding why everything happened the way it did. 5:45 a.m., start of the assault. The weather is clear but cold. They are going without oxygen. On a difficult section, the Sherpa turns back. Hristo is left alone. 11:10, communication from an altitude of about 8,500 meters. He is keeping pace and continuing the ascent. By evening, the summit. Message at about 18:10. Hristo spends about half an hour at the summit. He finds empty oxygen tanks and a flag. He takes the torn piece with him. The camera stays on the pyramid. These details will later be confirmed. The camera and the piece of the flag will indeed be retrieved by other members of the expedition in May. These are essential pieces of evidence. They will show that Hristo was on the summit and at what time. The descent is along the West Ridge, not along the normal route, where there are more tracks and railings. At 9:10 p.m., Hristo reports, "It is dark. He is staying at the bivouac." What does this mean in simple terms? It means spending the night right on the ridge, exposed to the wind, at the altitude of the death zone. There is no tent, there is no oxygen, the temperature is low. At such an altitude, the body quickly loses strength. Hands freeze, fingers don't work correctly. Any simple action is a problem. But at that moment, he had a choice between two bad options: go blindly along an unfamiliar route or wait for daylight and see the terrain. He chose the second option. At base camp, people shouted desperately into the microphone, "Izo, you are a strong man, don't fall asleep, you're Bulgarian." In one of his last messages, Protonov said, "I don't see anyone who can save me." The last contact was at 7:45 p.m. A single click of the radio switch was heard on the air, and then there was silence. He was still alive, but he couldn't speak anymore. Lyudmil Yankov was climbing parallel to him. He rose very high but saw no traces. At such an altitude, traces can quickly be covered. The snow is thin, and the wind blows away any marks. Yankov had to spend the night at about 8,400 meters. The place was uncomfortable and windy. In the morning, the weather finally broke. The storm destroyed the platforms and tore part of the railings. This meant that it was impossible to continue the active search. Any new attempt to climb up at that moment would lead to new losses. Why didn't Hristo follow the usual route to the South Saddle? This is a common question. The answer is simple. At night, without railings and people, crossing over to another route is just as risky as descending along the ridge. There are also cornices and wind there. It is easy to miss the right edge and fall. Hristo had no tent, no oxygen tank, and no support from above. Waiting for daylight was an understandable decision. By the evening of April 21st, it was clear that there would be no immediate rescue. The weather would not allow it. Any attempt would lead to new problems. The camps at the top were damaged. At base camp, they switched to a different plan. Keep the people safe, wait out the storm, and, if a new window opened, rebuild the upper part of the route. It sounds harsh, but it is the only solution when there is a storm at the top and the camps are destroyed. Let's note the critical risk factors that came together at the same time. The first is the late hour at the summit. At 6:10 p.m., it is already close to dark. The second is the descent along the west ridge, where there is little shelter. Third, the lack of oxygen. Fourth, spending the night without a tent at an altitude of about 8,500 meters. Fifth, the deterioration of the weather. Any of these factors alone is dangerous. Together, they produce the result we see: a person missing with no possibility of organizing an immediate rescue. Many people think that Hristo Protonov's disappearance on Everest is some kind of mystery, but in fact, everything can be explained logically and simply. The body was not found, and here's why. First, the West Ridge, which he was climbing, is not a well-traveled route. It is a complex open area with cliffs and cornices. If a person fell, they could be carried hundreds of feet down to a place where no one goes. On popular routes such as the South Col, many people notice and report traces, but here the flow of climbers is small, and chance finds are rare. Second, the weather at 28,000 feet quickly destroys traces. Wind, snow, frost, and that's it. No marks from crampons or equipment remain in a couple of days. GPS didn't exist back then, nor did radio beacons. If Hristo strayed from the route, it would have been almost impossible to find his tracks. Thirdly, after April 21st, a severe storm began. It destroyed camps 4 and 5, tore ropes, and made the ascent dangerous. Lyudmil Yankov climbed high, but was forced to descend due to deteriorating weather. For several days, no one could go up. Everyone sat in tents lower down the slope. Searching in such conditions was unrealistic. Fourth, when the weather improved on May 1st, the team first had to restore the route, re-establish camps, haul food, gas, and oxygen. This was a lot of work that took a significant amount of time. A search hot on the trail became impossible, and the expedition switched to a new plan: to complete the ascent and collect at least some data. Fifth, Hristo's route along the West Ridge is not a well-trodden path. It is a rare line without the usual bivouacs and railings. If something happened at night, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where. The result, the body was not found due to the challenging route, storms, wind, lack of technology, and destroyed camps. There is no mystery here, only the harsh reality of high altitude, where searching is almost impossible. When the storm subsided and the sun came out, the Bulgarian expedition started all over again. By May 1st, the weather allowed them to work. The team rebuilt Camp 4, then Camp 5, and brought food, gas, oxygen, and equipment for those who would go to the summit. The goal was clear: to reach the summit of Everest and collect clues that would help understand what had happened before. On May 8th at 3:20 a.m., Metody Savov and Ivan Volchev left Camp 5. There was a lot of snow, knee-deep in places, and they walked slowly but steadily. At 5:15 p.m., they reached the summit. They descended via an easier route, the southeast ridge, where there were more people and a better chance of getting help. At an altitude of about 29,000 feet, they had to spend the night without a tent or oxygen. Savov's feet were frostbitten, and he was running out of strength. But lower down, they were met by an Indian expedition, which gave them oxygen, a tent, food, and medicine. This saved their lives. On May 9th, Nikolai Petkov and Kirill Doskov set off from Camp 5 for the summit. They climbed very quickly, reaching the top in 7 hours and 38 minutes. At the summit, they found the camera that Hristo had left on April 20th and a piece of the flag. These findings are necessary evidence. They confirm that Hristo was at the summit at the specified time. This answers the questions: did he reach the summit? When did he do so? And did he leave any traces? Petkov and Doskov descended via the southeast ridge, met Savov and Volchev, and with the help of the Indian team, all four safely left the death zone and returned to the lower camps. In the end, the Bulgarians made the traverse. They climbed the rugged west ridge and descended the easier southeast ridge. This is an excellent achievement in the history of Everest. The camera and flag from the summit proved that Hristo had been at the top, and the traverse showed that the team was able to complete the route despite the storm fatigue and dangers. After the descent, Savov was taken to Kathmandu due to frostbite. The rest left the mountain. The expedition was over. The reports are simple: dates, times, who went, what they found, who helped. But these facts, the discoveries on the summit, the assaults on May 8th and 9, the help from the Indians, remove all unnecessary speculation. The team was welcomed in Bulgaria as national heroes, and Prodanov was posthumously awarded the highest honor. But after the fall of communism in 1989, these honors were revoked, and the surviving heroes felt forgotten, left with meager pensions. This story has a tragic sequel. In 2004, on the 20th anniversary of her uncle's death, his niece Mariana Prodanova-Maslarova attempted to climb Everest herself. She died at an altitude of 29,000 feet, almost exactly where Hristo disappeared. For 40 years now, no one has repeated the Bulgarian route along the cruel path. The mountain keeps its secrets, the body of Hristo Prodanov, and the echo of the radio call begging the national hero not to fall asleep. This is a story about what it takes to reach the top of the world and the terrible price that sometimes has to be paid for the desire to achieve what no one else has achieved. That's all, friends. Write your opinions in the comments, give us a thumbs up, and see you in the following video. Bye for now. Bye for